It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Salim Yaqub. Salim Yaqub is a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and director of UCSB's Center for Cold War Studies and International History. He is the author of Containing Arab Nationalism, the Eisenhower Doctrine and the Middle East, published by University of North Carolina Press in 2004. He's also the author of several articles and book chapters on the history of US foreign relations, the international politics of the Middle East, and Arab American political activism. His second book, Imperfect Strangers, Americans, Arabs, and US Middle East Relations in the 1970s, from which today's talk is drawn, was published by Cornell University Press in 2016. Professor Yaqub is now writing a post-1945 history of the United States for Cambridge University Press. On a more personal note, I took a course with Professor Yaqub over 20 years ago, believe it or not, at the University of Chicago. As a graduate student in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, I had been trained to think about the Middle East as a region unto itself, separate from the history of the United States. And I also thought of diplomatic history and cultural history as being two separate realms of academic inquiry. Taking Professor Yaqub's class, The US and the Arab World, not only opened my eyes to the promises of transnational and transregional history, but also showed how cultural outlooks and vocabularies often inform policymaking decisions, and therefore need to be studied in tandem with one another. Likewise, the history of Arab Americans has often fallen between the cracks of Middle Eastern studies and US history. One of the exciting contributions of Professor Yaqub's work has been showing how Arab Americans have navigated these geographic, political, and cultural realms. For his talk this afternoon, Professor Yaqub will draw on these lines of inquiry to discuss how soaring oil prices in the 1970s not only shaped Americans' views of the Arab world, but also affected the development of Arab American organizing here in the US. I'm excited to hear his talk, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Salim Yaqub.
Thank you very much, Professor Nassad. This is a real honor to be visiting with you and your colleagues and students. I appreciate very much the kind introduction. It is indeed, on a personal level, very delightful to be able to spend time with you after having had the honor of working with you at the University of Chicago when you were a graduate student there. It's very great to see that all of the people at the University of Arizona now have the pleasure of partaking of your brilliance as a scholar and a teacher. I also want to thank very much Dr. Ellison Spate for the assistance that she has rendered in making this event possible, and especially walking through all the technical aspects of it. So I'm going to go ahead and display a PowerPoint, which will show throughout the duration of my talk. And when it's done, I'll then reappear as a talking head and be delighted to engage in a colloquy with all of you. So I'm going to now attempt to share my screen. All right, then. Is everybody able to see the screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. My talk explores the Abscam affair of 1978 to 1980, in which several members of the US Congress were arrested for accepting what they believed to be bribes from wealthy Arab businessmen. The transactions were actually sting operations conducted by the FBI. Some of you may know about Abscam from watching the movie American Hustle, which came out several years ago. It's a very good film, though it doesn't tell us much about the Abscam sting operations themselves. I'll be examining Abscam in relation to two separate historical trajectories: growing American anxiety about the circulation of Arab petrodollars within the United States, and the rise of Arab American political activism. And yes, as Professor Nassar noted, this talk is drawn from my book, Imperfect Strangers. And this is a multidimensional study that looks not just at political and diplomatic relations, but at cultural, psychological, and demographic exchanges as well. It argues that the 70s were a pivotal decade in the evolution of the US-Arab relationship, a time when Americans and Arabs became an inescapable presence in each other's lives and perceptions, when members of each society came to feel profoundly vulnerable to the political, economic, cultural, and even physical encroachments of the other. These transformations, I argue, profoundly shaped the course of US-Arab relations in later decades and into the 21st century. But today I'm focusing on Abscam, which grew out of a particular set of events during the 1970s, touching on the role that Arab oil money played in the economic, political, and cultural life of the United States. The sharp spike in the price of oil after 1973 provided petroleum-producing countries with enormous revenues, petrodollars they were called, to invest in the global economy. By the second half of the decade, there was widespread fear in the United States that Arab governments, companies, and individuals were using their vast oil wealth to buy up America. The Abscam affair, in which FBI agents posing as rich Arabs induced several members of Congress to take bribes, reflected this anxiety about the potentially harmful influence of petrodollars. In the dominant American narrative, Abscam suggested that US democracy itself was vulnerable to foreign corruption. To many Americans of Arab descent, however, the affair demonstrated that anti-Arab prejudice had assumed alarming proportions and that concerted political action was necessary to combat it. This realization coincided with, and in some ways propelled, a transformation in Arab American political activism. Such activism was conspicuous throughout the 1970s, but earlier in the decade, it had concentrated mainly on foreign policy, especially the Arab-Israeli conflict. There had been less focus on demeaning or discriminatory treatment of Arabs and Arab Americans inside the United States. Abscam played a major role in placing those latter issues at the center of Arab American activism. Abscam also exemplifies a broader and rather ironic pattern. On the one hand, the increasing circulation of petrodollars was a cause of greater alienation and hostility between the United States and the Arab world. On the other hand, it spurred efforts to overcome that alienation and achieve a measure of mutual understanding. As I'm sure most of you know, in October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched major offensives against Israeli positions in the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, respectively, to end Israel's occupation of those two territories. During the resulting war, in response to a US arms airlift to Israel, several oil-producing Arab states cut off oil shipments to the United States and some other Western nations. The embargo, which lasted until March 1974, caused panic buying, hoarding, and real and imagined gasoline shortages in much of the industrialized world. In the United States, motorists waited in long lines, sometimes stretching for blocks, to buy gas. Once it became readily available again, gas was far more expensive than before. It cost 55 cents per gallon in the spring of 1974, as opposed to just 38 cents the previous summer. This may sound blessedly cheap, but bear in mind that the median household income at that time was about $11,000 a year. The price increase occurred because the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, which consisted of several Arab states, along with non-Arab members like Iran, Venezuela, and Nigeria, had taken advantage of spiking demand by raising its price from about $5 per barrel in October 1973 to nearly $12 per barrel in December of that year. Higher energy prices drove up the cost of everything else, sharply increasing the overall rate of inflation. Moreover, because energy is integral to virtually every aspect of a modern economy, the fact that it was scarce or extremely expensive crippled industries and businesses in many parts of the world, including the United States. This led to simultaneous increases in inflation on the one hand and levels of economic stagnation on the other. Ordinarily, those two problems exist in an inverse relation to each other. Economic policymakers can address inflation by slowing down the economy and thus risking stagnation. Or they can address stagnation by heating up the economy and risking inflation. But now inflation and stagnation were combined in a new condition known as stagflation. How in the world do you deal with that? The oil crisis was by no means the only cause of stagflation, but it was a major contributor to it. Stagflation remained a serious drag on the global economy throughout the 1970s and into the early 1980s. As a consequence of all this, there was, among Americans, a strong feeling of vulnerability, impotence, and decline, a belief that their nation had seen its best days and would now have to cede the initiative to others. In parts of the Arab world, by contrast, there was, at least for a few years in the mid-1970s, a mood of optimism, confidence, and assertiveness. For reasons I discuss in my book, this feeling dissipated quite rapidly in the late 1970s. But in the middle years of the decade, there was a striking perception of rising and falling fortunes, a sense that Arab wealth, power, and strategic opportunity were on the upswing, while the status of the United States was inexorably declining. For several years after 1973, the spike in oil prices allowed Arab oil-producing states to amass enormous revenues, and much of that wealth circulated through the global economy in the form of investments, bank deposits, and purchases of goods and services. The largest single destination of Arab capital was the United States, where in the second half of the 1970s, Arab governments and private actors invested tens of billions of dollars. Consequently, over that same period, there was enormous concern in the United States, sometimes bordering on hysteria, over the extent to which the nation had become vulnerable to economic control by wealthy Arabs. This sentiment was especially evident in American mainstream and popular culture, news coverage, movies, television programs, and novels. Not only were the Arab states trying to use their oil wealth to force the United States to change its Middle East policy, the argument went, they were buying up American properties at an alarming rate, thereby gaining a stranglehold on the nation's economic and cultural life. In novels and news stories featuring such encroachments, a common device was simply to list the various American locales, prominent and obscure, in which wealthy Arabs had purchased major properties, to show how thoroughly the tendrils of Arab economic power had crept into the nooks and crannies of American life. So, for example, the protagonist of Harold Robbins's 1974 novel, The Pirate, a rapacious Arab plutocrat named Baider el-Fay, is described as having wound up as the controlling stockholder in a small bank in La Jolla, California, a mail order insurance company based in Richmond, Virginia, and a home loan and finance company with 40 branches in Florida. A 1974 article in the Wall Street Journal reported that Adnan Khashoggi, a Beirut-based Saudi Arabian who has purchased 2 California banks, has also acquired about $1 million in raw land for development in California. The Kuwait Investment Company this month bought Kiowa Island off of Charleston, South Carolina. Wooten and Associates, a Dallas builder and developer, says it has got about $200 million in Middle East financing for an apartment complex in St. Louis. It's often forgotten that one of the most famous slogans to come out of 70s cinema, "I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore," was itself closely tied to Americans' sense of impotence and rage in the face of an economic onslaught from the Arab world. That line, of course, comes from the award-winning movie Network, released in 1976. As the title suggests, the movie is about an imaginary television network called UBS. One of the news anchors on UBS, a man named Howard Beale, suffers a mental breakdown and starts to make outrageous statements during his news broadcast. Now, instead of doing the humane thing and taking Beale off the air and getting him into treatment, the greedy managers of UBS decide to keep him on television because his wild rantings are good for UBS's ratings. Beale's popularity becomes especially evident in the movie's most famous scene, in which Beale delivers a wild diatribe about the eroding quality of life in America, the rampant inflation, the exploding crime rate, the worsening pollution, the incompetence and corruption of political leaders, and so forth, and then exhorts his audience members to get up out of their chairs, go to their windows, stick their heads out, and yell, "I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore." Across the country, hundreds of thousands of Americans follow Beale's instructions, demonstrating his power over the American public. The main villains at UBS are a brash young producer played by Faye Dunaway and a company executive played by Robert Duvall. The Dunaway and Duvall characters conspire to keep Howard Beale on the air because his ratings are so high. In fact, they're so thrilled with Beale that they give him his own time slot, an Oprah-style talk show on which he delivers daily jeremiads to a live television audience. On each show, Beale inveighs against the empty consumerism of American life, working himself into a wild frenzy. Each show ends with Beale getting so overwrought that he loses consciousness and collapses in a heap on the stage. And then the theme music comes on, bum, ba-dum, ba, you've been watching the Howard Beale Show. It's a perfect arrangement for UBS. The show is extremely popular, and it has an edgy and countercultural feel without threatening any entrenched interests. Beale can decry the shallowness of American life all he wants, but as long as he refrains from attacking anyone or anything in particular, no one gets hurt. But then the unpredictable Beale turns his wrath on UBS itself, raising questions about CCA, the corporation that owns the network, and the extent to which CCA itself is being controlled by sinister outside forces. Beale launches his attack just as the Faye Dunaway character is speaking at a convention for UBS affiliates in Los Angeles, as we'll see in the following film excerpt. Note what just happened here. Within the logic of the film, Beale is clearly insane, but it turns out he's right about the CCA deal. When it comes to the corrupting influence of petrodollars, not even a madman can exaggerate. Films like Network vastly overstated the extent of Arab investment in the United States. Although Arab governments and companies were buying up some properties in the United States, these transactions represented a tiny fraction of overall foreign investment in this country, less than 1% of the total. By far the biggest sources of foreign investment were countries like Britain, Canada, and the Netherlands. And yet somehow the specter of rampaging Dutchmen never inspired much fear in American hearts. Naturally, such cartoonish depictions of Arab economic power aroused keen resentment in some sectors of American society, especially among Arab American groups like the Association of Arab American University Graduates and the National Association of Arab Americans. These organizations did push back against negative portrayals, but not in a very systematic or sustained way. One individual who worked very hard on the issue was Jack Shaheen, a young Lebanese-American communications professor at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. In the second half of the 1970s, Shaheen began a one-man crusade against media stereotyping of Arabs. But because he was on his own, he didn't make much headway in getting media outlets to alter their content. The research Shaheen conducted in those years eventually appeared in his 1984 book, The TV Arab, which some of you may be familiar with. Not until the very end of the 1970s would a more organized Arab American effort along these lines start to take shape. I'll get to that effort in a moment, but I first want to underscore the contradictory ways that Arab petrodollars affected American society and US-Arab relations. For the most part, the circulation of petrodollars and public portrayals of the phenomenon created greater anti-Arab sentiment within the United States and thus greater antagonism between the United States and the Arab world. But there was also a positive dimension. In some instances, the availability of petrodollars helped Americans gain a more favorable impression of the Arab world. And sometimes the anti-Arab sentiment resulting from the circulation of petrodollars inspired a counter-narrative that placed the Arab world in a more favorable light. Higher education was a case in point. After 1973, oil-rich Arab countries contributed tens of millions of dollars to fund Middle East study centers at American universities. These donations aroused considerable controversy. Critics charged that Arab donors were corrupting the minds of American young people by sponsoring programs that burnished the image of unsavory Arab regimes or that encouraged unfair criticism of Israel. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with these sorts of controversies. In a handful of highly publicized cases in the 1970s, universities were obliged by public pressure to rescind large gifts they'd already accepted and return the money to the donor governments. That said, most of the Middle East study centers were able to keep their donations, and the programs they created fostered greater understanding of the Arab world and the Middle East on the part of the American students, faculty, and researchers who participated in them. Such programs also, of course, created more opportunities for Arab and Middle Eastern academics to visit the United States. There was another less direct way that the circulation of petrodollars fostered greater understanding of the Arab world within the United States. By encouraging such a high degree of anti-Arab sentiment, it caused Arab Americans finally to pool their energies and resources to combat that sentiment directly. And this is where Abscam comes in. The story of Abscam begins in 1977, when a federal jury in Pittsburgh indicted a career swindler named Melvin Weinberg on mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges. In American Hustle, Weinberg is the character played by Christian Bale. Weinberg made a deal with the prosecutors. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he would plead guilty and help federal authorities catch other offenders. So Weinberg and a team of FBI agents began conducting sting operations in cities up and down the eastern seaboard. At first, their targets were ordinary financial criminals, not politicians. But Weinberg had a knack for fashioning scams out of current events, and the ongoing drama over OPEC and oil prices was irresistible. He began representing himself to potential sting targets as the agent of an imaginary Arab plutocrat named Kambir Abdul Rahman, Abdul as everyone called him, who headed an equally imaginary company called Abdul Enterprises Limited. Abdul was interested in all manner of business: real estate, construction, entertainment ventures, financial speculation, and the purchasing of stolen artwork. All of the sting operations involving the fictitious Arab were grouped under the heading Abscam, short for Abdul Scam. Because so many of Weinberg's phony Arab projects required government licenses, favorable zoning decisions, and other kinds of official authorization, Abscam could not stay out of politics for long. Weinberg and the FBI soon found themselves in contact with Angelo Ericetti, the exuberantly corrupt mayor of Camden, New Jersey, who also served in the New Jersey State Senate. He's the one played by Jeremy Renner in the movie. Ericetti was delighted to learn that Abdul Enterprises was thinking of building a casino in Atlantic City, and happy too with the bribes that accompanied this news. He promised to get the state to issue the necessary permits. It turned out, moreover, that the mayor had acquaintances on Capitol Hill who could render services of their own for a share of Abdul's largesse. So in the second half of 1979 and into early 1980, Weinberg and the FBI went to work. Weinberg and an FBI agent named Anthony Amoroso met with several members of Congress, enlisting them in an array of schemes that amounted to government action in exchange for money. Occasionally, a second fake Arab, Abdul's associate, Yasser Habib, there he is, impersonated by another FBI agent, attended the meetings. Much of the promised government action involved bills in Congress to grant permanent residency to Abdul and Yasser, who supposedly feared being exiled by a revolution in their home country, sometimes identified as the United Arab Emirates, sometimes an unspecified Gulf Sheikdom. In return for pledging these favors, the congressmen came away with suitcases stuffed with cash or with promises of Arab investment in businesses they or their friends owned. Most of these encounters were secretly videotaped. In February 1980, in a cascade of leaks, scoops, and hasty official announcements, Abscam suddenly became public knowledge. One US senator and 7 House members were implicated in the affair. All but one representative would later be tried and convicted of bribery or related charges. In the mainstream media, opinion was divided between those who were disgusted by the congressman's alleged greed and dishonesty and those who were alarmed by the FBI's use of entrapment. For Arab Americans, however, Abscam presented a different sort of outrage. They basically said to themselves, wait a minute, a scandal erupts in which no actual Arabs are involved, and the net result is to make Arabs look bad? There's something wrong with this picture. Enter James Abarizik, a Lebanese-American attorney and politician who had recently served in the US Senate, representing the state of South Dakota. He teamed up with James Zogby, a young academic and activist, to form the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, or ADC. The core members of ADC were veterans of existing Arab American organizations, but the new group concentrated on discrimination and defamation. Following a planning meeting in Washington, D.C. in May 1980, and the opening of a national office in that city 4 months later, ADC expanded rapidly. Activists across the country began forming local chapters, spurred on by Abarizik's offer to speak at inaugural banquets. In December 1980, Zogby could report that 17 chapters had been established or would open their doors within the next few months. By the fall of 1981, the organization had 5,000 members. Over the same period, the National Office issued a number of short, polished studies on media portrayals of Arabs. The first two, on Abscam and on children's entertainment, were authored by Jack Shaheen. Working together, the chapters and the National Office developed a formula for racking up small but heartening victories against anti-Arab defamation. Local activists would identify a conspicuous but correctable abuse in their area, such as a demeaning advertising billboard or storefront display, and complain to the offending party with letters and phone calls. The National Office would follow up with objections of its own, sometimes supplementing them with complaints to the Better Business Bureau, or if radio or television was involved, the Federal Communications Commission. On several occasions in 1980 to 81, in Colorado, Florida, Massachusetts, New York State, and elsewhere, the sponsors of the offensive portrayals agreed to discontinue them, sometimes with forthright contrition. They'd thought the depictions were harmless fun and had no idea anyone could be hurt by them. Not all of the exposed offenders were so gracious, however. The Preston Company of Lowell, Massachusetts, marketing a line of charcoal briquettes known as Sheiks, produced a print ad urging customers to save oil and other high-cost fuels, burn Sheiks. ADC members from across the country protested to the Preston Company, whose lawyer responded with what ADC called a highly insulting letter in which he made crude references to sexual practices of Arabs. Soon thereafter, Preston announced it was pulling Sheiks from the market. ADC declared victory, but the company's owner, John Preston, told the Los Angeles Times that the product was being withdrawn only temporarily and only because of labor problems at the manufacturing plant. He hoped to sell more Sheiks in the future. Addressing the controversy in the Chicago Sun-Times, the columnist Roger Simon told his readers, "Some of you may find that ad mildly amusing, but there are a couple of million Arab Americans in this country who don't quite see the joke." It's hard to say which revealed more about the Arab American predicament at this time, the Preston Company's murderous incitement or Simon's bland validation of the impulse to laugh the matter off. So there you see a fairly promising model of Arab American activism emerging right at the end of the 1970s. The problem, however, was that Arab American activists and others who shared their perspective faced fresh challenges. The hysteria over petrodollars subsided, but new threats emerged on the horizon that caused Americans to continue to view the Middle East in very menacing terms. And in fact, this perception of threat coming from the Middle East grew more pronounced in the 1980s. So in that respect, Arab American activists continued to be on the offensive. Nonetheless, this set of events demonstrates the way in which concern over petrodollars helped to transform the nature of Arab American activism in this period. And so for that reason, I think it's worthy of further study in terms of how events occurring on the international stage can interact with what's taking place domestically and yield fresh insights into the nature of the Arab American relationship. So on that note, I will thank you for your attention and remain available to continue the conversation. And I very much look forward to the exchange. Thank you.